Get out of the way, old man. Some of us have places to be. The roar of the motorcycle engine drowned out everything else. The rider, dressed in a black leather jacket, eyes burning with fury, shoved 80-year-old Henry Caldwell aside, sending the frail veteran stumbling off the curb. Henry braced himself, his palms scraped raw against the concrete. But he didn't groan. He didn't fight back. His eyes, deep, weathered, as if they had seen the very gates of hell, followed Tyson Reed as he scoffed and sped off. An hour later, that smirk would vanish. If you believe that respect for those who sacrificed should never be violated, then join us at Veteran Best Stories. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss what comes next. Henry Caldwell's small apartment sat on the mezzanine above a quiet bakery in the suburbs of Chicago. The space was tidy. The walls were painted a warm cream. A bookshelf held worn book covers and a few faded photographs. From time to time, the soft scent of mild coffee drifted through the air, though he rarely brewed it strong anymore, not like in his youth. At 80, he was frail, his back slightly hunched, his hands trembling. And yet, there was a calm light in his eyes, one that still shimmered whenever he looked around his modest haven. His routines were simple, almost poetic. Every morning, Henry would slip on a thin wool sweater and a pair of worn gloves, then slowly walk down the breezy street. The city hadn't yet awakened. Mist still clung to rooftops. At the corner cafe, he would stop, order a weak black coffee, and savor its familiar aroma. Occasionally, he would unfold an old newspaper, scanning for current headlines, as if trying to bridge the distance between past and present. In the afternoon, Henry visited the public library. He enjoyed the feel of cool stone steps beneath his feet, the sight of glossy wooden bookshelves. The worn book covers held the mysteries of forgotten times. When children came to borrow books, he gently guided their pronunciation, explaining each sentence with quiet dedication, as though every word held a piece of his soul. His voice was soft, just warm enough to make the children fall in love with new stories. On weekends, he liked to stroll through the park by a small lakeside. The rippling water caught the golden glow of the setting sun. He would sit beneath an old tree, letting the soft breeze brush his skin. In those moments, memories returned. No one would guess that the frail man beneath the tree had once shouldered a heavy pack, trekked through suffocating jungle, and stood shoulder to shoulder with comrades in the heart of war's chaos. To the neighbors, he was just a quiet old man living a peaceful life. Emily, who lived next door, would often bring up warm bread from the bakery below. She'd glance at the old clock and call out, "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell." He would nod gently, replying with a vague smile. They didn't know that this man had once walked into the heart of disaster, using wit and bravery to save lives and guard secrets for his country. Each afternoon, he walked along the school's red brick path, where children scattered out of class in laughter. He paused, offered a kind wave, then moved along. One day, a little girl asked, "Mister, why don't you ever rest?" He smiled, eyes distant. Each step he took was a heartbeat of memory, each deep breath a quiet way of honoring the present, for the past had taught him how precious life truly was. At night, as amber streetlights lit the empty street, Henry returned to his small apartment. He turned on a desk lamp with a delicate porcelain shade, sat at the wooden table by the window. There, a photo rested, him with his fellow soldiers, faces solemn and strong. He picked up his old fountain pen. Black ink flowed onto white paper like a steady breath after a long storm. He wrote small fragments of memory, waiting for signals under the tension of silence, rustling leaves that felt like fate whispering. His handwriting, round and firm, carried the dignity of a man who once outwitted death. In the quietest hours, when the hum of the distant streetcar faded and the city lights dimmed, Henry felt a familiar emptiness. The past returned now and then like an uninvited guest, placing a hand on his shoulder and fading without a word. Once, he and his team had infiltrated an abandoned base. The dim moonlight blanketed crumbling walls. The wind howled through cracks like a warning. He remembered the shots fired, the thick gray smoke at dusk, a mark of the fierce struggle they endured. That memory had become a part of him now, like a river flowing back into the sea, irreversible. Even now, the thin wool sweater couldn't hide the weight of memory. People saw a kind, elderly man, but only he knew that his heart still stirred at the thought of fallen comrades. On the desk, beside the pen, lay a worn sheet of paper with names of those who never came home. He had promised never to forget them. Every time he walked through the park, he would look up at the vast sky, where white clouds drifted like echoes of the past, reminding him never to take freedom or simple joy for granted. The apartment remained simple and serene. Neighbors might still call him Mr. Caldwell, unaware of the story behind those calm eyes. To the children, he was just a gentle elder, patiently teaching them to speak. But to Henry himself, each passing day was bound to the past, like a heartbeat tied to an unbroken promise to uphold timeless values. And though the weight of memory could be heavy, he smiled still, believing the present was beautiful. The past had given him wings, a quiet gratitude, and a boundless kindness toward all. Tuesday afternoon, the sun slanted through sparse tree branches, casting dappled shadows along a narrow street in suburban Chicago. Henry Caldwell walked slowly down the stone steps of the library, one hand steadying the faded canvas bag slung across his shoulder. Inside were a few thick history books, their spines brushing together, creating a hushed sound only fellow book lovers would notice. Beneath his worn coat, each of his steps was deliberate, as though every second had been weighed with care, as though he wasn't merely leaving the library, but stepping out from a world of safety into another, one far more chaotic, no longer measured by patience. The sidewalk buzzed with life. The scent of toasted bread from a nearby bakery mingled with the tang of gasoline, together forming a familiar symphony of the city. Henry moved toward the curb, where the traffic surged like an unrelenting flood. He stood there, frail but steady, eyes scanning the brief gaps between rushing cars, trying to find a rhythm, a safe window to cross. He didn't hurry. There was nothing chasing him. No job, no appointments, just a habit and a day passing by in quiet peace. Suddenly, the air split open with a violent roar. A deep, throaty engine blared from afar, then thundered like an explosion at close range. A large chrome motorcycle, straight out of an action movie, leapt onto the sidewalk, screeching to a halt right in front of Henry. The tiles beneath its tires trembled as the young man aboard slammed the brakes, leaving behind the scent of burnt rubber and a harsh black streak. Tyson Reed, a name not easily forgotten in this neighborhood, late 20s, built like a boxer, clad in a dark leather jacket studded with glinting metal under the afternoon sun. His arms were covered in fierce tattoos, patterns so tangled they felt like a silent warning. Tyson's eyes sparkled with impatience, as if the world wasn't moving fast enough to keep pace with his energy. He jumped off the bike, leaving the engine to roar behind him, and yanked off his gloves with irritated force. Behind him stood the electronics store he meant to enter, for nothing more than a small accessory. But Henry, with his canvas bag, slightly tilted posture, and familiar pensive air, had unintentionally become an obstacle. He wasn't challenging, just present. Yet to someone like Tyson, that presence alone was a thorn in the side. "Hey, old man, sidewalk's no place for daydreaming." Tyson's voice lashed out, sharp as a thin blade cutting through the quiet air. Henry flinched, not from fear, but because the outburst had torn through the train of thought he'd been following. He turned, his eyes calm, lips moving gently. "Just waiting to cross, son." But the softness only inflamed Tyson's anger. He sneered, lips curling into a smirk full of contempt, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Yeah? Then move it, or vanish," he snapped, waving his hand like brushing off something worthless, his eyes dripping with disdain. Henry remained still, said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, where a small opening in the traffic had appeared, then quickly vanished. He wasn't being stubborn. He simply knew when to move and when to wait. His slowness wasn't weakness. It came from a life trained to measure danger with a glance. Eyes that had once pierced the fog of war, that had tracked bullet paths in the dark, that had located targets in a blink. Those eyes were now calmly assessing a busy street. Tyson saw none of that. To him, Henry was just age and frailty, a slow-moving stone in his path, something inconvenient and unremarkable. He stepped in closer, his shadow falling across Henry's shoulders like a dark cloud. A few passers-by paused, watching, but no one intervened. To them, it was just an arrogant young man and an outdated old man, unaware that in this ordinary moment, two opposing worlds had briefly touched. Henry didn't tremble, even if his hands weren't as steady as they used to be. He didn't bow his head. For a second, his eyes flashed, with something buried deep inside. A memory, perhaps. Maybe it was that rainy jungle night, when he and his team buried themselves under rotting leaves, listening to the smallest sound, deciding life or death in a single breath. Or the time he stepped into an enemy base, where every object could be a threat. But still, he kept his heartbeat steady. Or maybe it was simply because, after all he'd seen, an angry young man shouting in the street was no real threat at all. Tyson, blind to that gaze, scoffed, grabbed his handlebars, and disappeared into the store. The glass door clapped shut behind him. The motorcycle engine howled a little longer, then died. Henry stood there a while longer. Then, as traffic finally slowed, he stepped gently into the street and crossed. His shadow stretched along the asphalt, blending into the late sunlight. No one noticed, but that quiet moment, so small to the world, was something profound to him. A symbol. A man who had walked through war, who now chose to walk through life with patience and grace, even when the world no longer moved at his pace. Tyson's roar echoed through the crowded winter street, like a blade slashing the steady rhythm of the afternoon air. "Did you hear me, old man? Get lost!" His voice sharp, seething, his eyes blazing, as if one more word would set him off like an explosion. He stepped forward, shoulders broad, invading the small pocket of space around Henry. The air before the old man seemed to thicken, heavy with aggression. Henry shifted slightly to the side, trying to give way, but the young man wasn't looking for a path. Without waiting for a response, without a second's regard for age or frailty, Tyson shoved Henry hard in the shoulder, pouring every ounce of frustration into that push. It wasn't just physical, it was rejection. like a slap to the dignity of a man who had lived a life rooted in kindness. Henry staggered. His foot caught the uneven edge of the curb. His thin frame crumpled onto the rough concrete, like an old leaf torn from a branch on a windy day. His canvas bag slid from his shoulder, hit the ground, and toppled. Thick history books spilled out. Their covers collided with hollow thuds, awkwardly echoing through the bustling street. His left hand struck the pavement. Fingernails scraped against the stone, leaving a long, ragged scratch. Blood began to well from his palm, dark red against the dull gray brick. Not life-threatening, but glaring, stark in that odd stillness where even the hum of engines seemed to pause. Tyson? He was gone. Not a glance back, not a flicker of remorse. He pushed through the glass door of the shop and disappeared inside, leaving not just an old man sprawled on the ground, but a piece of his own humanity behind him, discarded like dust. On the sidewalk, a few people had seen it. Someone inhaled sharply. Another shook their head, frustration clear in their eyes. A woman in sunglasses mumbled something under her breath, perhaps to purge the discomfort. But, as always in this city, they kept walking. Everyone had somewhere to be, some reason not to stop. A moment of injustice, too fleeting to interrupt the rhythm of apathy. Henry didn't cry, nor was he angry. Slowly, he braced himself and sat up. His knees throbbed, his shoulder ached, but his eyes held that same calm, even though behind them stirred a quiet ache. Not from the fall, but from being dismissed. That contempt, that sense of worthlessness, of not being seen, was what hurt most. It left no bruise, but pierced deeper, a wound that settled where pride had once been worn like a silent metal. He began picking up the books, his hand still bleeding, his movements slow yet deliberate, as if he feared the pages might be stained by the grime of the street. The covers were scuffed, a few pages folded, but he didn't complain. Each book he retrieved felt like a fallen piece of honor, something sacred he needed to lift with care. Just as he reached for the last one, a youthful figure stopped beside him, a young woman pushing a baby stroller, her expression alarmed, brown hair fluttering in the gentle breeze. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she gasped, kneeling down, her hands gathering the final book. "That guy shoved you? That was awful." Henry gave a slight nod, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, dear. I'm all right. Just a fall." He brushed dust from his trousers, then pulled an old handkerchief from his inside pocket, gently blotting the blood as it spread faintly over his skin. The gesture, though slow, radiated poise, a composure forged through years of facing storms far worse than this. When the woman offered to call the police, he shook his head. Not out of forgiveness, not out of fear of trouble, but because he understood. Noise didn't always change anything, and all he wanted now was to go home, to return to the quiet comfort of books, to a place where he didn't have to brace himself against a world growing colder by the day. He slung the canvas bag back over his shoulder, walked on with his usual gait. His shoulders sagged slightly, not from pain but from a familiar weight, the loneliness of being invisible in a crowd. Yet in his eyes, there lingered something, not hope, but endurance. Like a tree in winter, no blossoms, no scent, but roots sunk deep, patiently waiting for spring to come again. Henry had no idea that, from across the street, a pair of cold eyes had been tracking his every movement. Those eyes held no emotion, no blink, no hesitation. They simply observed, analyzed, and calculated. Inside a dark-colored SUV, discreetly parked beneath the shadow of a tree, The man sat still, yet every sense in his body was strung tight, like a drawn bow. He was dressed simply, gray shirt, jeans, one hand resting naturally on the steering wheel. But it was that very naturalness that made him dangerous. Everything about him was precise to the point of chill, from his posture to the way his gaze followed every motion of Henry and Tyson, like a sniper waiting for the squeeze. He had witnessed it all, Tyson's senseless aggression, the violent shove into the shoulder of a frail old man, the collapse onto concrete, the slow drip of blood from Henry's hand, the books scattering across the sidewalk, and the young man walking away without hesitation, leaving Henry in the indifferent blur of the city. When Henry quietly stood, brushed himself off, and declined assistance, the man in the SUV didn't intervene either. Because his job wasn't to act immediately, it was to observe and initiate. He opened a small compartment beside the wheel and retrieved a black communication device, no larger than his palm. It wasn't a regular phone. It was an encrypted satellite unit, the kind reserved for operations outside the reach of conventional law enforcement. One button, a few brief tones, then a voice, firm, clean, unwavering. Eagle to nest, incident at Alpha Point. His fingers moved swiftly over the device's navigation screen, eyes never leaving the street. Subject: elderly male, suspected former operative, attacked by member of local biker gang. License plate confirmed. He recited the plate number of the motorcycle Tyson had ridden. His eyes didn't blink, like a biological camera, every digit etched into memory as if engraved in steel. Pausing for a second to confirm the signal, he continued. Subject Caldwell sustained no serious injuries. Returning home, requesting update on asset protection protocol. The phrase asset protection didn't refer to property. It was code, used within the network he served. A covert system designed to monitor, support, and protect individuals who had once operated in special missions. People like Henry, former assets from deep intelligence programs, now living in quiet civilian obscurity. People too valuable to lose. A soft confirmation tone replied from the system. The call ended. But somewhere, a chain had already begun to move. A traffic camera at the next intersection was now streaming live to a remote ops center. A digital map began tracing the motorcycle's potential path. A behavioral analytics team was alerted. The domino effect had begun, all triggered by what seemed like a meaningless shove against an old man. The man inside the SUV didn't flinch. He returned the device to its slot, adjusted the rearview mirror, and turned his gaze back to the street. Just as the store's glass door swung open and the young thug emerged. Tyson walked out with the same arrogant stride, not once looking back at the scene he had caused. A smirk tugged at his lips, the kind worn by those who believe the world bends to their will. He pulled out his keys, slid them into the ignition, and the motorcycle engine screamed back to life like a taunting laugh in the middle of the city. Tyson had no idea that his actions had opened a door to a sequence of events beyond his imagination. He didn't know that within minutes, a file would be created bearing his name, his license plate, his face, fingerprints recalled from a minor incident years ago, his social connections, hangout spots, even deleted social media footage. Everything would be quietly analyzed in the background, like a machine programmed never to overlook a single thread. As Tyson revved and weaved into traffic, the SUV's engine also started. But it didn't chase. It didn't need to. Every detail had already been fed into the system. The SUV rolled forward, calmly joining the slow current of vehicles like a nameless creature. Inside, the man remained silent. There was no rush. The net was cast. The bait had been taken. Ahead, Tyson sped off, thrilled by what he believed was freedom. He didn't know that every turn he made, every gas station he paused at, every face he ignored, was being logged. And when the moment was right, the world he thought was his would shrink, down to a single button press. The SUV turned in the opposite direction, leaving behind a quiet street now dipped in the golden hue of dusk, where an old man had just endured a fall, and where a silent storm had just begun to rise. Tyson leaned back in his chair, gripping his third beer, his mouth still open from the roar of his triumphant laughter. In the dim, battered bar called Pig's Den, everything around him radiated decay and neglect. Smoke-stained walls, tables and chairs patched with black tape, old speakers blaring an incoherent rock track. He sat there as if he were the center of the universe, boasting about his victory over the old man earlier that day, with the signature arrogance of someone who had never been taught boundaries. "He dropped like a sack of bricks, man," he shouted, laughing until the beer spilled from his mouth. "Didn't say a word. Face went pale like he was ready for a casket." His friends, tattooed, crude, and just as empty, burst into meaningless laughter. They slapped his back, poured more beer, and pounded the table in drunken approval. To them, Tyson was a leader, a fearless guy, someone bold enough to pick a fight, even with an old man who couldn't fight back. In that dimly lit corner, sweat gleaming on his face beneath the yellow glow, Tyson truly believed he ruled the world. But outside, the world was already shifting, without him knowing. Just 100 meters down the street, a plain white utility truck sat quietly beneath a tree, as if it had been parked there all day. Two men in electric company uniforms stepped out, carrying voltage meters, but their eyes kept scanning, sweeping every angle. Every button they pressed didn't check power. It transmitted data. Just a few steps away, a black SUV with government plates rolled slowly past the bar. Its tinted windows hid the man inside, but his eyes were fixed, locked, on the bar's entrance, as if mapping every move he would need to make. A glance, a nod. The plan was already in motion. Overhead, the faint hum of a helicopter blended into the city's sounds, barely noticeable. But if someone had looked up long enough, they'd see it wasn't passing by. It was circling, drawing a radius in the sky, with Pig's Den at the center, and its main target seated inside, laughing freely, unaware he'd become a red dot on someone's screen. Tyson knew none of this. He kept telling his story with exaggerated gestures, replaying his imagined battle. He threw his heavy boots on the table, slapped the back of the guy to his left, and laughed until he nearly choked. No one at the table noticed the sudden silence creeping into the bar, or how guests at distant tables had quietly stood and begun to leave. Then the door swung open. A shaft of fading sunlight sliced into the room, stretching the shadows of two men as they entered. They weren't large. They carried no visible weapons. They didn't need to speak. From the first step they took, the room stopped breathing. The rock music faded into background noise. Boozy eyes snapped awake, turning toward the door as if someone had pulled the pin from a grenade. They wore dark clothes, unbranded jackets, solid boots. Their eyes were steel. No shouting, no hand signals, just presence. Just the way they stood there, scanning the room, was enough to press the air into stillness. Every whisper choked off, every movement froze. Outside, two more figures appeared. They didn't enter. They simply stood, blocking every exit. The back windows had been locked in advance. No one would leave without passing between the two men guarding the front door, like stone sentinels at a fortress gate. Tyson saw them. His lips were still shaped in a grin, but the laugh caught in his throat, trapped by a chill crawling down his spine. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was the unnatural silence of the men who had just arrived. His friends stiffened. Their eyes darted. One tried to push his chair back, but his trembling legs hit the table's edge. No one had said a word, but everyone knew. The game was over. The night had arrived, and the self-proclaimed king of that dim, forgotten corner was about to be dethroned. The two men walked straight to Tyson's table, without hesitation. They didn't need to shove, didn't need to threaten, but every step they took carried the weight of something greater, a power not born of muscle, but forged through discipline, experience, and years of silent service. Men like them needed no introduction, no medals pinned across their chests. Their mere presence was enough. The lead man stopped before the table, his gaze locked onto Tyson. His voice was low, not loud, but sharp as finely honed steel. Tyson Reed. It wasn't a question. It offered no choice. Tyson sat up straighter, puffing out his chest as if he still clung to some shred of confidence. He scanned the bar, but no one dared intervene. The air felt blocked at the entrance. "Yeah? Who's asking?" he growled, but the words came out weak, strained in an oddly familiar way. The man didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as though gauging Tyson's reaction. After a brief pause, his voice came again, steady, mechanical. "An hour ago, on Elm Street, you encountered an elderly gentleman." Tyson's face went rigid. His arrogant grin died away. A cold shock ran down his spine. How could they know? Only a few people had been there. No photos, no police, no one stepped in. And yet... "So what? The old man got in my way," Tyson retorted, but his voice was cracked. He no longer believed he was in control. The man opposite him remained unshaken. His gaze was icy, penetrating like a sniper's scope. "That gentleman," he said slowly, "is Sergeant Henry Caldwell, now retired. His file records operations in places you wouldn't even dare dream of." Tyson went pale. The air around him felt viscous. His friends, heads now bowed, fell silent. None dared to look up. The second man, who had been standing behind, finally spoke. His voice was firm, measured, not loud but enough to make the heart pound. "You shoved a man who bled for this country, just because you were in a hurry." Tyson began to tremble, not out of fear of being struck, but because he understood. These men hadn't come to beat him. They had come to warn him, in a way that a wrongdoer would never dare violate again. A boundary that only those who had walked through war could draw. The lead man moved a step closer. His tone remained calm, but his words were like steel edged into flesh. "Sergeant Caldwell is a national asset. His well-being is closely monitored by certain parties, and we are among them." Tyson swallowed hard. Sweat beaded on his brow. He stammered, I'm sorry." The man raised a hand, palm open, not in forgiveness, but as a signal to stop. "Sorry is not enough. You need to understand that actions always have consequences. From now on, you will never approach Sergeant Caldwell. If you see him, you take another route. Your existence must not cross his path ever again. Understand?" Tyson bobbed his head like a robot. No more words followed. He knew this was not a request. It was an order. A clear line had been drawn, and if he crossed it, There would be no second warning. The man glanced at Tyson's glossy leather jacket and mud-stained boots. He tilted his head slightly, then said quietly, "And consider stepping away from that biker gang. Too much noise sometimes attracts unwanted attention." They turned and left without awaiting any response. No threats voiced, no glance back. But the bar felt hollow once they walked away. Tyson sat frozen, then suddenly bolted to his feet and dashed out the door, as if possessed, leaving behind his motorcycle, his buddies, and his half-finished beer. That night, he disappeared from town, and no one ever saw him return. At that very moment, in a small apartment above an old bakery, Henry Caldwell sat by the window, holding a newly borrowed library book, his eyes tracing each line. He had no idea that just hours earlier, his life had nearly been upended in a way no one wanted. Nor did he know that there were those, eyes sharp as hawks, still watching over him, protecting him as an irreplaceable part of this nation. The next morning, as always, he woke, adjusted his jacket, and stepped out for his walk. The corner cafe remained open. The morning breeze still rustled through the trees lining the sidewalk, but something had quietly changed. That street corner felt unusually peaceful. No engine noise, no prying eyes. Tyson's motorcycle was gone, as if it had never existed. A silence heavy with meaning. Justice need not be loud. It does not require flashing lights. But when it moves, people know, somehow, those who think they can harm others without consequence will learn a lesson of their own. Because there are men like Sergeant Henry Caldwell, men who gave their youth for freedom, who always deserve protection. Not only by law, but by a loyalty that never retires. If you believe in honoring silent heroes like Sergeant Caldwell, share this story. Hit like to support veteran best stories, where memories are never forgotten.